Hello and welcome to Very Much Mistaken. I'm Chris Parrott.
And I'm James Parrott.
And we are here to discuss the second round of the 2001... no, it's not. It was 20 years ago. The 2021 World Championship from Imola.
It's all right, we're new to this.
Yes. And I text you, sometime after the race, because with a newborn child, I don't always get to watch these things live, and said, words to the effect of Formula 1 is bloody good at the moment.
Yeah.
And a unique race for so many different reasons. Never has Mazepin been in so good a company. I think of the 20 drivers, maybe the two McLarens, did they spin off?
No, I can't remember. No, I can't remember them spinning off. But yeah, because like Verstappen had his little bit during the safety car. Yeah. Leclerc went off in the formation lap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Perez went off more times than stayed on the circuit, and I think the final tally was 1,065 spins.
Yeah.
Throughout the whole race. So yeah, there was a lot to digest, and obviously the key variable, of course, was the weather.
Yeah.
And the role that played in teams having to think on their feet in terms of before the race even starts, what tyres do we start on?
Yeah. Because it was it's always a strange call when you see two drivers. Well, apart from the Haas people, it was Gasly and Ocon. Only two drivers to go for full wets. You're kind of thinking, surely you'd trust the kind of evidence of all the other drivers thinking these intermediate conditions.
Or the guy in the other car in your own team.
Yeah.
Presumably the team share the same weather information.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange one because it was so, like, Gasly was so clearly hampered by that one decision. Like, again, it must be so frustrating for him. Really good Saturdays and then just dodgy Sundays first two times.
And it's evidence as to why it's not just about raw speed in terms of where you're going to line up in the pecking order. We've discussed at length sort of the strength of the midfield and how AlphaTauri should be towards the front end of that battle. But in actual fact, when it comes to Sunday, if you're not experienced in battling and making the right decisions at the right time, it doesn't matter how quick your drivers are or how quick the car is, you're not going to extract that peak performance as a team consistently.
The conditions had an effect on kind of like pre-race, the tactics people were going to do, which tyres to go on, and then could argue that they had a big impact on the start with Verstappen getting ahead of Lewis at the first corner, apparently due to him starting in second, which I think is a wet weather tactic, easier on the traction, and perhaps that was why he got such a good. Aside from good reactions, his decision to start in second gear obviously probably helped that there, and then just went into, I think it's actually corner 2, but it's kind of the first corner, or the first main braking zone anyway, and pushes Lewis a bit wide. But again, I think on first lap you kind of can get away with things like that. First corner, first lap, it's always going to be a bit manic.
I think Verstappen has demonstrated that he has really transitioned from a driver who would sort of go for everything and rely on other people moving out of his way, and sometimes having more accidents than he needed to, into a driver who can really judge where the limit is now very well, and obviously has the capability to push things to that limit because he's a very good driver. And I think there's an interesting psychology between him and Lewis, and between the Red Bull package and the Mercedes package. And I think Lewis's two mistakes, which were uncharacteristic, for me, the first one being at the start, sort of hanging out around the outside when he was always going to end up being bumped off the circuit in that situation, as you say, and then as we'll come to later, his mistake lapping the Williams of Russell, are born out of that extra pressure that I think he senses from Red Bull, the fact that they're so competitive, and the fact that he knows that Verstappen is very quick and potentially has the measure of him. And it's going to be really cool, I think, throughout the remaining for the rest of the season to see Lewis under pressure in that way and how he responds. And yes, he made mistakes, but you have to say he responded to them very well.
With a healthy dose of luck as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, 100% responded very well, comparing him being down in ninth from lap 32 onwards to Bottas being down in ninth from lap 1 onwards, Bottas could just never get going, whereas Lewis was able to get through the field and get to second relatively comfortably.
Yeah,
I'd say kind of inevitable when you're watching it, wasn't it?
Yeah, certainly, and I'd say the first half of the race, because the race was literally split in two, with a break in between, was kind of punctuated by the pack settling into their outright pace positions, because they were kind of jumbled up by virtue of the rain, cars being on different tyres. The key element of that first stint then was who could extract the best performance out of the intermediates for long enough so that you could get to a reasonable point where you could only make one stop, switch straight onto mediums, and go to the rest of the race. And I think there are a couple of interesting points to sort of pick up within that. The interesting dynamic within McLaren that played out in terms of Norris requesting Ricciardo to be moved over and Ricciardo moving over, and Norris sailing off into the distance thereafter. It's always interesting when you have that where teammates, there's one saying that he's being held up by his teammate, they switch it around and then he doesn't pull away.
Does that happen quite frequently, or is it?
I mean, to be fair, no, because I think the teams generally know when a driver is trying to pull a fast one and sort of say that he's being held up. That was clearly was the case in that instance. Yeah. And I must admit, it was one of the surprises for me was certainly not that Norris ended up in third, because he had great pace all weekend. It would have been up there in qualifying but for a mistake. But how big a difference there was between him and Ricciardo, it was sort of matched only by the difference between Hamilton and Bottas. So yeah, the first part of the race was kind of, lots of action, lots of overtaking, drivers battling with poor grip. It didn't matter what tyre you're on, you're battling with poor grip, and that was really the only point in the race where we got to see a real sense of where Mercedes and Red Bull were in those conditions. And I think actually it looked like it was pretty evenly matched, but I think Hamilton may have been a bit quicker
at points. Yeah, definitely at points.
Certainly towards the end of that stint.
Yeah.
But it looked like where track position is kind of key at Imola when you're closely matched, I think Red Bull were going to always have the we're always going to be able to cover off what Lewis was able to do.
Leading on from, I mean, because actually one of the crazy things was how much the field changed throughout the race,
and the spread, and how quickly it spread out.
Because like Gasly went from 5th down to 20th or something, and I guess it's kind of like it just showed that it was like the different halves of the race, because it was kind of like a wet intermediate race for the first half. Then people were testing out when it was dry enough. So for instance, Vettel probably went on a couple of laps too early, but he eventually got to a point where he was setting fast.
And at that point, you're the guinea pig for the field, aren't you? Yeah. Shot to nothing. You may as well go for it. You started from the pit lane.
And then we kind of went into this, and the field changed accordingly, because people were adapting to those conditions better. Like they were talking about how just no one knew where the grip was, where the braking zone started and stuff like that. So people were braking at very different periods, or very different points before a corner and stuff like that. So you kind of had that kind of mixture, rearranging the track. Rearranging the field positions, and then when you kind of went into this essentially dry race or a dry line race, then it kind of changed the fielding again, where people were it's more kind of just about your skill and pace as a driver.
And dry line race is a key facet to it, because in a way it's easier to drive on a full wet track because the amount of grip is evenly distributed across the full width of the circuit. But as soon as there's a dry line that you can exploit, stepping off it becomes treacherous, particularly when you've made that switch to the dry tyres. And that's what caught out Lewis Hamilton. I think it caught out Perez as well, in terms of just stepping off the line, losing traction, losing grip, spinning off, making mistakes.
And then obviously it also had probably the biggest impact on the race with the Russell and Bottas Russell and Bottas incident.
That was a mad phase because I suppose people switched onto dry tyres. Hamilton went for an overcut on Verstappen, I think leaning on his experience from Turkey, where there was you knew you were actually going to lose performance switching onto the dry tyres, getting them up to temperature, which is a lot harder on a cool and a wet track. So Hamilton knew, well, actually I might be able to go a bit faster for a couple of laps than Verstappen, come out in front of him, then be slower because his tyres are up to temperature and mine are not, but I've gained track position. And I think that may just have worked, but Mercedes had a slow pit stop and it cost him, I think he was in for over 4 seconds instead of 2 to 3. Yeah, and that meant that Verstappen was able to get through. But it was a phase where, again, because the field was spread out so much, they were going through traffic. Hamilton was, again, gaining. And I think they came to a bunch. Lewis sensed an opportunity to gain more time on Verstappen if he could get through the traffic quicker than him. And which is why he made the mistake he did going around Tosa, running off that dry line, just getting onto the wet part of the track, losing grip and sliding, sort of Vettel-esque from Germany 2019, and finding himself slowly heading towards the barrier, and then clumsily clouting into it, and then executing. If that 3-point turn was on his driving test, he would have failed. Instant fail for that maneuver. But I think you're in a way, and this will sound strange. In a way, you're impressed with how, and he's said this after the race, how he didn't give up. He was stationary in the gravel with a broken wing for over 30 seconds, which knowing what that means in terms of your likelihood to be competitive for the rest of the race, a lot of drivers may have packed it in at that point.
That's what I was thinking watching it. I was like, oh, this guy is just a serious competitor, because Martin Brundle pointed out he was really, really low revs on the gravels to make sure he didn't dig in. And then he reversed across on the gravel and then was driving around this front wing on and a lap down by this point. And I was thinking, I swear I've seen drivers in this position just take the wheel off and get out. But he obviously, I think he realises he's in a fight and is really up for it this year.
Hamilton had just spun off and Bottas was stuck in ninth, being or attempted to being passed by a Williams, and that was the next incident. And they happened, I think before Hamilton or just after Hamilton made it into the pits. We had the Bottas Russell incident, and it was one of those really dramatic ones where you see the aftermath and there is just carnage by virtue of the polystyrene marker boards that they put into the braking zones, which were obviously taken out. That's scattered everywhere. Carbon fibre, shards of the cars is scattered everywhere. You can see the back end of a Williams, a Mercedes in the distance. And it just looked like an absolute bloodbath.
And then Russell getting out of the car, and we're all like, do I think he's going to go and check Bottas is okay? Going there just to make sure he's all right. It was a really big collision. Oh, he's giving him a few hand gestures. Oh, it's all just love for them too. And then no.
No, it was Piquet and I can't remember who did he run into? Salazar. I don't know. Piquet in sort of 82 in Hockenheim was taken out by a back marker and had a full-on punch-up with him, which, to be fair to Piquet, was quite common back then. Drivers were much less respectful of each other or wary of PR connotations for having an argy-bargy out of the cars.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth talking about the incident and talking a bit about Russell's reaction.
Yes,
because I have my opinions on Russell's reaction. I've seen like other opinions on it.
Well,
but perhaps if we go through the incident, so
from looking at Bottas's onboard, there wasn't an awful lot there that told you exactly what happened, which I think is indicative of where responsibility lies, because from that point of view, just above Bottas's helmet, he was occupying a line towards the middle of the track, was sort of positioning himself towards the racing line, but wasn't veering. There was no sudden movement or anything, not something that a layperson could intuit. Then suddenly, he appears to be hit by something. He's sent off to the left and then has this massive massive accident, and it's only when you go to the onboard of Russell that you kind of see what happens. And there was no sudden swerve or move from Bottas. I would say he was drifting towards the right hand side of the track, but there was always room for Russell to get past him. There was a car's width there for him to go through. He just drifted onto the grass, which was extra slippery, and he lost control into Bottas.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I don't even think it was actually. They said he drifted on the grass. I've yet seen a video of him hitting the grass. I still think it was actually. It looks more like it was just a wet part of the track. And I think it was Damon Hill said that it was a wet part of the track that he moved onto and he didn't lift.
Do you think there is blame to be apportioned to one driver over the other?
I don't think it's like clearly either one of their, like, one person's made a massive error. From things I've read and things I've watched, I'm of the opinion that it is Russell's prerogative to make sure he is driving appropriately for the conditions. And Bottas he does make a move slightly to the right, but it's not big, and it's also him going towards the racing line to get prepared for turn 2. But he's also given Russell more than a car's width, and I would then say Russell is making the move going onto the wet line. He has to make sure that he doesn't lose control there. But it's a tough one, because I would also say that the move, it seemed to me that the move was on. I mean, he had DRS. He was going past him quite easily, and he just, even the slightest little move from Bottas just spooked him, and that just meant that he made an overcorrection which put him onto the wet line, which span him and made him career into Bottas's car. So I don't necessarily think it's really fair to give it to either one of them.
I think if you frame it in terms of who was more responsible, who could have done more to prevent the accident from happening, I think Russell could have done more by having a better assessment of the general conditions of the track and the amount of grip he could reasonably expect to have under the circumstances. The fact that he reacted the way that he did, and so his account of the accident was that Bottas weaved very slightly, which he has described as sort of like a known move for almost forcing someone who is faster from backing off, because you just do a subtle little movement in the direction of where the guy is going to pass, in the hope that as Russell said happened, spooks them into backing off. But rather than spooking him into backing off, it spooked him into going wider than he initially intended to, going on a wetter part of the track and then losing control. And he's described this as being sort of an unwritten rule amongst the drivers that you don't do that going into a braking zone, because it can lead to accidents such as it happened. But I just don't see this little move that has been made. I can't see it myself. So I have to disagree that that's what happened. I don't think that that's enough to say it was any one driver's fault. I think it was a racing incident as the stewards described it, and for me the key circumstance which drove it was the closing speed of Russell, by virtue of the DRS, and how much that reduces the amount of time a driver has to react to something. So let's talk about the contretemps thereafter, which is quite atypical now. You used to see that sort of thing a lot because in part because drivers tended to crash into each other a lot more in the past. They don't do so that often, but also they tend to go their separate ways. I think the last recent remonstration like that I can think of was, I think it was Trulli and Sutil in Brazil in 2009, where they crashed into each other and had a bit of Trulli was very upset about it. But what do you make of Russell's reaction?
I don't really have a massive problem with him just blowing a fuse and feeling like he has to go and have a go at someone. And if he felt like Bottas actually did put him in as much danger as he thought he did, I can kind of understand it. And plus, you're in the heat of the moment. You're you're in the heat of the moment. You're also one of these kind of like top level competitors who, to get to these positions, you often have these kind of character traits of being like fiery or being determined. And he was there ready to make a pass. He was hoping to get points for Williams. All of these things were going through his head, and he probably was just like, I'm too angry. I'm just going to have a go. I don't necessarily know if I would say that you'd like to think he kind of cared that he would have worried about Bottas's safety first, or whether he was okay. But I kind of let him off for it coming in the heat of the moment. And one of the things I really like about Russell is he is actually a really good communicator. Even when he's like how he is when he's like talking to people over the radio or when he's in interviews. He answers questions really honestly, really well, and really clearly. And I think he's actually I think he's a good character. And and for the grid, and I think this might be just part of his character, because he's never been afraid to shy away from criticizing people or criticizing things or giving an opinion. And maybe some stuff like this is maybe just comes with the territory with him now, and we should kind of like get used to it, embrace it, because one of the good things about F1 compared to certain other sports is actually drivers can kind of express themselves a lot more. I don't know. I don't think it's. I think it's because it's an individual sport, and there's none of this kind of like team ethic kind of thing that you're all like plying like the party line. Whilst there's obviously a massive team, it is still the guy in the car kind of like doing the job mainly. So I kind of am like, yeah.
You also get their instant reaction in a way that you don't with other sports, because you hear you get so much from team radio now that people can then put to them, and the drivers are sort of almost know that they're more exposed in that way than other sports people. If you think to sort of controversial incidents that happen in football or in rugby, you watch how the players react on the field, and you can't really hear what's going on, but you can hear their reaction. And then when they're asked about it, they tend to they very often just play a straight bat or leave it and give the media handbook answer. But you're right, you get these sort of instant reactions from drivers a lot more often, and as you say, they're more exposed to mistakes because it is them in the car ultimately. And I mean, your broader point, I think I agree with. I would just add, I don't think it is good for Russell's career that he reacted so demonstrably against a driver for the team that basically the driver whose seat he's hoping to replace. And unfortunately for him, there is a slight narrative building, and you get this sometimes with drivers who are very talented, but it seems they always snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Thinking back to last year at the same circuit in Imola, he span off under the safety car when he was in 10th. Obviously, there was the incident in Bahrain, in Sakir, sorry, you should say, as that's the race it was. It wasn't his fault, but nevertheless, he was in a position to win the race, and then he didn't. So there are 3 instances where he could have won a race and didn't because it was a team mistake, but, it still happened to him. And then 2 instances in Williams where he could have scored points, which is the equivalent of a win for them, given where they are relative in performance terms to Mercedes. And something has happened. A mistake was made, an incident which has lost him and his team valuable points. And to be honest, I think those 2 incidents in his recent past contributed to his frustration. And he said after the race that, why was Bottas fighting so hard? 9th place to him is meaningless, whereas to us it's everything. Well, I think that should have been a part of his assessment in terms of going into the incident, that he's in 10th. He's got a point for a team that would be desperate to score a point. Don't go for the super risky move in difficult conditions, if it's better just to hold back and wait and see what happens, because there was a queue of cars there. He was probably going to have other opportunities to get past, but he went for that one, and there was this crash, and a lot of frustration sort of just came out of him in a way that's refreshing and nice to see. Whether it was a good thing for him to do or not, personally, I think you can debate that, but ultimately I agree with the point.
Yeah, well, I mean, the only other, I mean, I think the most famous one I can think of, which is like going back to all those like F1 season review VCR like tapes that you had, that I would go through. I think there was a Schumacher, it was either Coulthard or Hakkinen incident, where Hakkinen, I knew it was a McLaren car, I don't know who it was, he was slowing down, and for some reason he slowed down. Was it Coulthard?
Coulthard in
Belgium
in 1998.
And Schumacher went into the back of him, knocked his like front right off, and then in the pits afterwards, charged afterwards, having to be held back.
Yeah,
like that. I mean, that's just like, that's kind of like what you want out of competitive sport. It's like it's an interesting thing to happen, because these guys are so driven and determined with what they do and to excel and do well, that they sometimes just all they want to do is go and have a go at someone.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a dangerous sport, and you have a big crash like that. If you've been in a minor accident on any road, it's an adrenaline erasing moment for you. So doing it at 200 miles an hour is definitely going to get the juices flowing, and you're just gonna let it go. It's amazing it doesn't happen more often, to be honest.
Apart after Russell's reaction, I think we should talk about Toto Wolff's reaction as well. I don't know if you've read any interviews with him about what he said.
I've seen that he has criticised Russell.
Yeah. But it's very interesting what he's criticising him about. It is two things. One of it is about the impact it's going to have on the cost on the cost cap and the upgrades they can do now, because they've essentially had to write off a car, and rebuilding a new car for Bottas is going to cost so much that it's going to mean they're not going to be able to upgrade their car as much during this season now, which I think is so interesting. And then you think about, it's a weird thing to think that they're in their calculations of how they're budgeting, how do they factor in these moments where you might have like a car written off because you'd have to just say, oh, should we? They obviously really don't want to happen, but do they have to budget for like one or two happening a season? Yeah. I mean, it's a strange little dynamic that's come into it.
But it's interesting then that Toto brings that up as a thing to. The implication from him mentioning that is that he thinks it was Russell's fault that there have been these accidents. And all of these costs are being borne by the teams.
Exactly, and this goes on to the second point, and I think it was the bigger point that he made, was that Russell should have known, he should have assessed the conditions, seen it was a Mercedes driver in front, and essentially because he's an employee of Mercedes racing for Williams, he shouldn't have made the move. And which is, the thing is, like, Toto Wolff is in his position for a reason. But as just a fan, I did not like the thought of someone not being able to race for their own team because they're essentially employed by another team.
Yeah, and I mean, there's all sorts of ulterior motives that you can speculate as to why people bring certain things up. I think Toto, yes, Russell is an employee, but Toto's got to back his driver, and leave it to Williams to back theirs. And you can kind of see how people will position themselves in their corners and state their opinion, and then disagree probably, and then move on from it. But it's difficult, but I think just a fact of life that you have. There are only 20 places on the grid. And the bigger teams want to sort of be nurturing the next generation of drivers, and they're going to farm them off to smaller teams. I prefer that than a grid full of paid drivers, to be honest, because that means talented drivers like sort of Russell and Ocon are on the grid when they might not be. If there wasn't this kind of like sort of lone system. Nevertheless, it's an interesting comment and an interesting angle, an interesting perspective. as this was the end of his race, it's probably worth reflecting on what a miserable Grand Prix it was for Bottas, and kind of reminiscent, though not quite as bad, even though it ended before the end, as Turkey, where this seems to be the conditions he thrives on the least. Changeable conditions, struggles to get grip and performance and temperature into his tyres, and is really shown up the most relative to his teammate in terms of the difference between the two of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a pity for him as well, because I think San Marino's it's a track that suits him if it was dry, and he wasn't even able to get the tyres going on the Saturday during qualifying, which is why he ended up in
7th or 8th.
8th, yeah, and apparently
was in 9th.
Yeah. He just couldn't get his tyres going, and which meant he was nowhere near quick enough. Apparently,
and
so.
We're only 2 races in, but where it's going to be such a close battle between Verstappen and Hamilton, I think both teams are going to pull the support driver role pretty quickly on Perez and Bottas respectively. And it was, so we've discussed Hamilton going off. We've discussed the Bottas and Russell crash. So we get to the first ever half time in the history of Formula One. Probably lasted a little too long in terms of an effective half time. They must have had a whole 2 oranges instead of half an orange. So at that point, Red Bull are 1st and 5th or 4th.
I don't know, to be honest. It was something. It's something like that though.
Cause first and
yeah,
and Mercedes were 9th.
And a lap down.
And a lap down and out.
Yeah.
So this was ka-ching moment for Red Bull. All their Christmases had come at once. I was catching up, so I didn't pick up as to why they let the lap cars unlap themselves. Did they say why they did that, and if that was the normal procedure?
It's a normal procedure, and essentially it's because when they're having to, it's just an easier way, I think, technically, to reset the grid. So they essentially just, because Martin Brundle said something like, it just means they don't have to control alt delete on lap time. So obviously if they were going to restart them again from a starting point, I think it must just make it difficult for the computers to understand at what point things are on the track. But I don't really know, but it just seemed like a way of making it cleaner for something.
Because there was the option to go for a full grid restart, wasn't there? But they went for a rolling restart.
Yeah, it was one or the other, and they were speculating as to why. I imagine it's just because conditions weren't that great. They'd just seen a big crash. They perhaps didn't want to see another big crash.
And this is where Martin Brundle made a brilliant point, which was, the safest thing to do is to not turn up. And there is an element of that where you just need to find the right balance between allowing the drivers to test themselves in difficult conditions and just being a bit too safety conscious.
See, I disagree with him there, and I don't think, because I don't actually think it was completely down to safety. They weren't worried about a big crash. I think they were just worried about the spectacle, because there'd been like a safety car at the start of the race. There'd been a big gap during because of the red flag, because of the Bottas Russell incident. I just think they wanted to make sure there was going to be some racing and it was going to finish. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure the start is a little bit less unpredictable and a little bit less messy, which is by doing a rolling start. I think that was more than them worrying about someone was going to get hurt.
Well, they all feel vindicated by both Red Bulls. Was it at this point that Perez, was it on that lap that Perez spun off, and then
it was that lap, or like
it's
amazing a few laps
that,
after. It's
amazing that this is the race where it's impossible to keep track of how many drivers spun when there wasn't a race on.
Well, because Perez went off during a safety car as well.
Perez went off during a safety car. Leclerc went off in a safety car. I mean, Vettel spun. No, Verstappen basically spun when the safety car was out. It was in terms of. It was clearly very, this doesn't happen very often. So clearly the conditions were very difficult. It's the only explanation. But they restarted the race. There was all sorts of drive errors up and down the grid in terms of how this restart would impact the final finishing. We should talk, I think, at this point about the bold strategy call McLaren made to put both their drivers on the soft tyres as opposed to the mediums, and what their thinking was behind that.
Yeah, I mean, what their thinking was, I suppose they were just, I guess that because the track temperature would have been cooler because it was a wetter race. They felt, because I mean they talk about kind of like windows of tire, like the tire temperature window, and obviously the hotter the tire is, the more it's going to degrade. So they obviously felt like that the soft tire might be able to last in the window longer than it usually would because the track temperature was lower.
And they wanted the initial grip, to give Norris an advantage at the restart in terms of being able to get past.
Yeah, and on a track where track position is so key, on these kind of like on these restarts or starts, getting into a good position after like the first few corners, you're in a very good position to finish the race there. Which is like as Verstappen showed, he got into first place after the second corner and led the rest of the race. So I mean, it seemed it seemed a very smart decision just to say to Norris and Ricciardo, let's get some like good lap times in, get some track position in early on the restart, and then just manage it until the end.
I really like it, and I really like what it says about McLaren and where it is as an organisation, that they clearly have empowered the people on the pit wall to make the calls that they think are the right calls, even if they're risky calls. They back themselves to execute their strategy, and then the key ingredient and the final ingredient is they have the ability to execute that strategy. And it's worth reflecting at this point probably on what a good race Lando Norris had, both in terms of his relative performance to Ricciardo, who I think is still in this grace period of getting to terms with the car. In terms of raw pace, I don't think you would expect him to be 20 seconds. Well, in theory, double that, because that was only over the second half of the race, 20 seconds slower than his teammate. But Norris fought from seventh, where he qualified, to second at one point. Withstood a lot of pressure from initially the two Ferraris to hold on to his second place, and then kept Hamilton back for a number of laps before he was ultimately able to pass him. And I think you kind of saw it after the race, Hamilton's reaction to Norris. You could tell that he was impressed with how well he drove, how fair he drove, and how he was able to defend his position without putting himself or Hamilton in any undue risk, but also recognised when the deal was done and didn't lose any time unnecessarily in doing that, because there was two things he had to do there. He obviously had to fight Hamilton for the position, but also not do it by losing lots of time and therefore put him under pressure from Leclerc and Sainz, who are right behind as well. And he was able to do both of those things.
Because you could in Lando's position, you could really push, overwork your tyres, and then really like put yourself under lots of pressure towards the end of the race with Charles Leclerc coming up behind you. So I think he must have just accepted that I'm not going to be able to hold Lewis off for the rest of the race. Third place is a really good finish. One, from where he comes from, where he's come from at the start of the grid. Two, just in general for McLaren in the context of like where they are compared to Red Bull and Mercedes. So he probably was just like, yeah, let's hold him off as long as I can, using the pace that I've got at the moment.
And it was fine margins, because you could track the gap going into Rivazza 1 and Rivazza 2. If coming around that point, Hamilton was 0.8 of a second behind, and that was enough for Norris to keep second going into Tamburello, and it was only 1.5 tenths difference. When it got to about 6.5, I remember seeing that and thinking, okay, he's got him here. That's the difference it needed. Let's skip forward to Jeddah at the end of the year, and it is let's for argument's sake, Hamilton is leading, Verstappen is second, and they are equal on points. So they are racing for a fastest lap point to claim the championship. Are we excited by that prospect, or is that giving too much value to being quickest on a random circuit in the calendar?
I think on the whole, just like added little details like this that will affect teams' decision makings around tactics, I think makes it interesting, and also it also improves the variability of ways of winning, because you're not essentially, whilst you're obviously trying to win the race, actually what you're trying to do is win the championship. Winning every race is obviously the best way to do it, but if there's like other little things you can do to also help your cause, it means you've got to think about those as well, and that like adds another little ripple to just like how people were watching the race as well. It's like, oh, one of these guys could like change onto softs for this bit of the lap, give up some time, but maybe go for the fastest lap, stuff like that. I think it's just it's another interesting thing. Like we've seen bonus points in other sports work really well because it kind of changes people's mindsets. Because for instance, in this race, even though Verstappen won, Lewis would have been really happy by the end of it because he got the fastest lap point and has won, which is like it's just another interesting like storyline to think about and for fans to get engaged with,
and leads the championship as a result.
Yeah.
Mercedes have got in a stronger position in the constructors championship by virtue of the fact that the number 2 drivers, and it's a shame that we're calling them that this early in the season. In their battle, so far Valtteri is outperforming Perez, and Perez had a weekend to forget after qualifying on the front row of the grid to make a mistake during the first safety car, and then bizarrely just overtake. I don't know. I've no idea why he thought he could just repass, and why the team didn't tell him, no, you can't do that. You need to give those positions back. Even then, when he was, I think that put him down into 5th place or around there. 5th or 6th with that penalty. They were still in a cracking position, and I would have thought that the key role he would have played there was not only trying to get up the grid, but he would have also, I think, been able to check Hamilton's progress. It would have been interesting to see if Red Bull told Perez, look, you sit tight in 5th and just keep Hamilton behind you. A big disappointment to him if he had aspirations to sort of to join the championship challenge. Even at this early stage, I don't think he and Valtteri realistically can expect to fight for the championship this year.
Yeah, it's disappointing because like it was really nice seeing him out-qualify Max Verstappen, and you're like, okay, yeah, Perez is going to make his mark on the team this time around, but perhaps it was just a bit too soon working with a new car. But hopefully, you can see there's like bits there from the first 2 races which shows that Perez is in the right. He does deserve his spot because he had a really good recovery drive in Bahrain. He then qualified ahead of Max in Imola. He just had a bad day at the office on Sunday.
Yeah, and he was in good company, unfortunately.
On Ricciardo, I think he will be disappointed just because
it's never good when you are told to let your teammate by and he disappears off into the distance.
Yeah, exactly. And he's also, I think he knows that he's got more pace in him, and I think everyone actually knows that. But I don't think, but he's also too experienced a driver to like worry or panic about it.
The other I think big bonus will be that Ferrari seem to have cemented themselves towards the top of that midfield battle. I think they'll be disappointed that they were beaten to that podium spot. But given where Sainz was again, he even chastised himself on the team radio at the number of mistakes he was making. But again, he followed a similar example to Hamilton. You give credit to Hamilton for never giving up. Sainz never gave up, and he was able to recover to a very strong 5th. And Leclerc in 4th. I think this was a track that suits Ferrari, less penalised in terms of engine performance. So they're not going to do this well on every circuit, but there's plenty of circuits like Imola, and I think the one they're going to next in Portugal is going to suit them too, where they'll be challenging McLaren for best of the rest. We'll just keep keep rattling through, because the racing actually didn't stop in terms of position changes until after the checker flag fell, because Stroll was demoted from 7th to 8th, was it?
Yeah, pass on Gasly.
For his pass on Gasly, where he ran off the circuit to complete it. There, I think that was just a straight, we're going to swap you round job, wasn't it? And then Raikkonen, what did he do wrong?
I didn't see it. It was something to do with the safety car restart.
Which was, I'm sure he did do something wrong, but it was a confusing situation. But nevertheless, that meant he dropped from.
He had a 10-second penalty,
which was very costly because he was in 9th, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And then
no, he was ahead of Gasly. So Gasly made up 2 spots after the
so he was
flag.
he was in
8th. So it went, so Raikkonen was in 7th, Stroll was in 8th, and Gasly was in 9th.
Right.
And then Gasly went up 2 spots.
Well, there you go. But that promoted Alonso to score his first point for Renault. So that promoted Alonso to score his first point for Alpine. So, I mean, Alpine will be, I feel, both pleased to get both drivers in the points, but also disappointed that that's kind of where they are.
Yeah, I mean, they actually had a good Sunday really, because I think the pace didn't really. It looked like they were struggling a bit in qualifying, and I think Ocon seems like he did a good job to get it into Q3.
Yeah.
And then Ocon was the other guy who made the error of going onto the wet tyres from the start. But I guess you could call it a good recovery drive by him, again helped by the various safety cars and red flags and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't really know what they take from it, because again, they're not properly challenging the top of the midfield like they were last season when it was them, what was Racing Point and McLaren. They seem to have fallen back on them. But they said that they had a good upgrades package coming in for this race, and I think 2 points finishes probably shows that they were correct in that.
Yeah, they were there and thereabouts. And what's encouraging actually is that if that midfield is actually maybe not, if McLaren and Ferrari are perhaps a bit ahead of the midfield, I think that is actually encouraging for Alfa Romeo and Williams, that there are going to be more races like this where it's a bit of a crazy race and they are in with a chance of scoring points. And it would be nice if, I don't think there's any expectation that Haas are going to score points, but it would be nice if all the other teams were able to score points this year. And I think it's going to be possible based on this race. Again, AlphaTauri would be disappointed that both their drivers, they made some poor strategy calls and then their drivers made mistakes on the track. And they're not getting the full performance out of the car at this stage. So I think they'll be disappointed.
Yeah, Tsunoda was one of the guys yo-yoing up and down the grid throughout the race. I think he started from the back, then got into the points, then went to the back again, and then managed to get up to 12th.
I must admit, all 3 rookies had spins this race, and actually Mazepin's was the least egregious in terms of Tsunoda just spinning off on the restart, Schumacher spinning off under yellows into the wall. Yeah, which isn't great, and then Mazepin's was quite sedate in comparison.
I can't actually remember Mazepin's.
He just sort of idly spun off. Almost
was it at the Acqua Minerale where quite a lot of people were going
I think it was exactly there. But part of me actually, I always think F1 should be hard for drivers to get into, and it should be difficult for rookies to master the car and actually to be able to push it to the limits, and they need to acquire the experience and the knowledge of how to drive in Formula One before they can really maximise their potential. And I quite like it that if they have an off, they all have an off race, because it kind of shows that that it is the pinnacle of the sport. And prattling through, and Vettel it looked like it was a bit of a technical DNF where they were decided to retire him right at the end of the race, and it wasn't great. It wasn't a great race for Vettel, but it wasn't really in his hands with the issue they had at the start before the race even started, and then he was the guinea pig for the field in terms of switching onto the dries as a punt to nothing, but he still won't be happy, and I don't think Aston Martin will be happy with their points haul at this stage in the season either.
Yeah, I would just like to say I think Lance Stroll should be getting rid of his pay driver knock, that reputation, because he's got the car into Q3 both of these races. The car clearly relative to last year is not as good, and he in many often is like making up spots. It seems like he needs to work on his racecraft around overtakes. He was making a lot of mistakes on that, and that ultimately cost him with the Pierre Gasly position. But I think he's just a legit driver now, and
I would agree. If you say he's so far he's comprehensively outperforming a 4-time world champion teammate, you've got to say, well, that's kudos to him. Even if his dad is Darth Vader in disguise. Haas, kind of 2 laps down, but both cars finished, and that's...
It's a strange one seeing like Haas just they do the race, but you never see them, and there isn't even any point in seeing them. It is just like watching you. It is just like rookies getting some experience. That it's kind of like, they've got their trading wheels on. Just go out, just race as hard as you can. I mean, even when Schumacher's on team radio with his race engineer, and the race engineer was really like being so nice to Schumacher because he was feeling really down about having to do lap after lap without a front wing because the pit lane was closed. it was just funny situations hearing like a professional F1 driver being spoken to like that, but maybe they are rookies in a tough situation. I think it like apparently the car is just like a nightmare to drive, so they're probably going to learn quite a lot from this year.
Well, and if they get in a better car next year, it will blow their minds. It is actually an amazing insight that we get in terms of team radio. You don't get that in any other sport where you hear, the coaches on the sideline and what they're saying to the players on the field. So we should be really, I think, grateful that the teams allow that to be broadcast, and it adds a real insight and an understanding of the emotions which are at play. Talking more broadly about how Formula One is presented, I sometimes feel like we get too much information. I particularly dislike the sort of overtake predictor graphics where they tell you it's not enough to know that a car is catching another. They're catching them and they're going to catch them by this lap, and this is how likely it is they're going to pass them. And you just sort of think, well, where's the jeopardy? Where's the suspense? Where's the drama? You're telling me what's going to happen. I don't think I need that in my Formula One coverage, and I would quite like an option, a bit like where they do alternative commentary sometimes for different sports, where they have a graphic-free option. Because we've been at Silverstone and have literally had a stopwatch and timed ourselves the gap between cars to try and work out if one was catching the other.
Oh yeah, we were at Stowe, just after Stowe, and we had our...
And there's something exciting about that. And I've always said this about one of the best things about going to a Grand Prix is you don't necessarily you have less of an idea about what's going on, but that in itself is quite exciting because you're kind of having to work out what's happening, and then you and sometimes someone says, oh, this person's got a penalty, and it's like, oh, so this person's got a penalty, that's amazing. Whereas obviously you just find this all out if you're just watching it at home. And granted, I was very young, but I can remember the first Grand Prix I went to in 1997, and Schumacher in a Ferrari retired, and it sort of took didn't you sort of notice after a few laps, hang on, there's a Ferrari missing, what's happened? And then like a rumour spreads, Schumacher's out, oh my god, Schumacher's out. But that's in a way that's more interesting than X is catching Y at 2 seconds a lap and is going to pass with a 90% certainty.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's everyone's got to cater for like a multitude of like types of fans, don't they? And like the wheel-to-wheel racing is comfortably the most exciting like part of the track, where you see like drivers going through corners like side by side and seeing who's going to come out on top of it. It is the most exciting thing. People do really like the overtakes, and I guess with stuff like that, they and when because of the dirty air problem, it's actually doesn't happen that much in Formula One at all. I guess they just really trying to hammer home, like, look, we do have overtakes. You just have to wait another six laps to see one, something like that. So I guess that's who they're catering for. But and the people who go to the races and kind of like get to experience the atmosphere there, they would want something different out of it, I suppose.
Just to touch again on Williams, and it's just a quick note to say that yes, it was a missed opportunity, but I think there is hope there that their riskier strategy in terms of aero philosophy. I think there are going to be opportunities for them to score points this year. They missed this one, but I think there's going to be more, and there could, and this is a nice segue, be an opportunity at the next Grand Prix, which, based on the track layout and sort of what happened last year, might expect a similar kind of race in terms of where the cars are in the pecking order.
Yeah, so Portugal, lots of gradient changes. One big long straight, and then kind of to slow to medium pace corners. It's actually weirdly similar. It's kind of like someone designed the Portugal track and then looked at asked Spain and said, yeah, you can, and Spain said, you can copy me, but just like change things a bit, because there are very similar elements to it. But it was a really good race last year. It's a really interesting track because of the kind of like changes in gradient. I think the one thing, if we're just to touch on the Williams thing and their aim to go for peak downforce, it was a very windy race last year, and that won't help their peak downforce chances. But
no, as was Bahrain, which obviously, and they weren't particularly racy there.
Yeah, but no, I'm looking forward to Portugal because it had a good, well, not debut but re-debut last year, and judging by the start of this year, it should hopefully be another great one. So
we're just to sort of close, perhaps we're 2 races in, and in terms of the heavyweight contest at the front, it's 1 apiece. And that looks set to continue. The picture is emerging of I think 2 teams which are pretty evenly matched, and this is what is perhaps the most exciting. The key variable is going to be the drivers and their performance and how the circuit characteristics suit them as much as how it suits the car.
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to ask a question. Can you see another team winning a race, and it's not necessarily down to the top 2 like losing both their drivers, like they win a race on merit as opposed to fortune?
No, not on merit. No, there would have to be a set of circumstances which severely hampered the top teams. That being said, judging on performance, it would only have to severely hamper Hamilton and Verstappen, a minor hamper Perez and Bottas, because they're perhaps not quite at the same level, given neither of them have finished on the podium yet. Oh no, Bottas has, but not quite at the same level. So a circumstance where maybe Perez and Bottas are out position in qualifying, and then something happens to Hamilton and Verstappen. I think Hamilton and Verstappen are too good to run into each other. So I think it'd be very unlikely for them to be in a battle where they take each other off. But you can, if each of them had an issue that took them out, or either put them out of position without enough time to regain it, then that's where you want to be. If you're Ferrari and McLaren, you want to be there to maximise that opportunity. But there's clearly a big gap between the top 2 teams and the rest that is not enough to be cancelled out by something that isn't pretty major.
Yeah, because I just had the thought, just because McLaren, I think, showed genuine pace round Imola, which I think, I don't necessarily know exactly with McLaren, but you could argue is more of a it isn't like a power. Well, it's not a power track. It's a more of a downforce track with one straight. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if we see McLaren picking up a good win this season.
I think
out of the rest of the lot, that would be.
It wouldn't surprise me that if that happened. I think there's every chance that they will be that there will be a circumstance where McLaren could win a race, but you've got to maximise those opportunities, and the stars will have to align in a certain way where that race happens when they're in the position to capitalise.
Yeah.
But all in all, it was another great race, and the season is unfolding as everyone hoped so far. There's 1 point between the two drivers between Verstappen and Hamilton in the Drivers' Championship. Mercedes are on 60 points, with Red Bull only 7 points behind on 53 in the constructors, and so far so good in terms of where Formula One is at.
Yep. In the drivers, we've got, so obviously Lewis and Verstappen 1 point apart on 44 and 43, but then Lando and Charles Leclerc are third and fourth. Have to wait for Bottas in fifth, and then Sergio Perez is down in eighth. So it's not the Noah's Ark that it used to be.
Yes, and that is an indicator of a good season. If the drivers' championship is really mixed up in terms of within the teams, and so far it is. So 2 weeks off, next 1 weekend off, and then we're back. So we will be back after the Portuguese Grand Prix, which is in 2 weeks' time, for another review on Very
Much Mistaken.